Limitations are cool, especially in a team game. If you could genuinely do everything that will ever be required of you in the game all on your own, then it could almost feel like the option of bringing other players is more like the helper mode for when you can't, due to a skill issue. But when the game actively makes it so that each player in a team brings something different to the table, and everyone lacks something the others have, it leads to a much more interesting whole, in my opinion. However, in the context of an MMORPG like Final Fantasy XIV, where every few years a new expansion comes out and the jobs supposedly need new additions to them, at some point you will be faced with the reality of needing to give a job something that already has everything it could ever want. And what do you do then? Let's talk about limitations. Let me reiterate. Limitations are cool. I think part of what makes so many jobs in Final Fantasy XIV feel similar, or almost identical in some parts, is exactly the fact that when you really get down to brass tacks, while the exact order of buttons you need to press to do the big damage is different, exactly what happens when you do is exactly the same. They don't really seem that different. Let's take a look at the various roles to compare. Viper and Dragoon don't have any defensive cooldowns beyond role actions, but hey, they kinda have better ranged options, mostly Viper. Note, better ranged options, not uniquely. In contrast, Reaper and Samurai have amazing defensive options, and Ninja and Monk do have defensive options. They also have significant cooldowns on them. Ninja also kinda have the better ranged options among the six, similar to Viper a bit. Meanwhile, Monk doesn't really have ranged options. Not really. Between just these aspects, what typically stands out is Viper and Dragoon don't have defensives, Samurai and Reaper have great defensives, Monk doesn't have ranged. Aside from that, what we usually end up focusing on is damage output, notably, who's doing the most, and whether Ninja's Dokomori gives it an advantage or not due to how it applies in an alliance raid context and such. For the ranged physicals, if we similarly try to not talk about specifically damage output, because while the shape of the damage output is slightly different, it isn't exactly unique, then what we land on is Machinist has one extra damage reduction effect in Dismantle, Bard has Nature's Min and Warden's Paean, Dancer has Improvisation and Curing Waltz. We could also, I guess, bring attention to the fact that Bard and Dancer has slightly random damage output, while Machinist does not, aside from random crits that all jobs have and all that. And if we go over to the mages, it gets even sillier. Red Mage and Pixelmancer have different shapes of raid-wide defensives, while Black Mage, Summoner, and Pixelmancer, again, have different shapes of personal defensives. Summoner, and especially Red Mage, have Raise, and finally, Pixelmancer, and especially Summoner, have different shapes of incidental healing options. Something that might be worth mentioning is also the varying capacity to move freely the four mages have, where I will simply refrain from commenting on that because, while I can say Black Mage is way more mobile than the average player might believe, I will probably both overestimate and underestimate the mobility of the three other mages. However, due to how mobile mages are, they don't stand out that much from ranged physicals, do they now? For the healers, White Mage has a slight disadvantage on damage mitigation, but is not unable to provide it. Sage and Scholar are more limited in spot healing and raw healing output, but again are not unable to provide it, especially Scholar with cooldowns that allow it to almost do anything you need, at least for a time. What often makes Astrologian seem a bit stacked is that the one thing it can't do is maintain big barriers like a barrier healer, but Neutral Sect, similar to Scholar's Seraphism, means it isn't unable to provide it. In other words, the distinction between healers seems a lot more wishy-washy than you'd think. It isn't about what they can't do, it's about what they can do a little less of. And finally stepping to the tanks. When not looking at their damage output, we get the distinction that paladins uniquely can maintain damage at range. They also have the most concentrated mitigation. Gunbreakers have the strictest rotation and the greatest capacity to stretch out their mitigation. Warrior has the weakest mitigation, but the most convenient invuln when that matters, and the most self-healing when needed. And Dark Knight has the weakest self-healing, but better mitigation than Warrior definitely. What makes it really hard to make out some clear differences between the tanks is that defensively they all have largely the same base toolkit, and then the spices on top is what actually makes the difference. Warrior's short cooldown has the least mitigation, and they don't have an extra mitigation option, not really. Paladin's short cooldown has the most mitigation, and they do have extra. Things like that. However, the fact that most jobs in a particular category or role can do all the same things is likely intentional. By making sure all tanks have largely the same toolkit, a fight designer just has to make sure whatever the lowest common denominator between them is, can do a thing, and then all four can. And by making sure they are not too different, it means that when a fight is designed to be beatable by the weakest link, it doesn't make it too easy for the strongest link. Similarly, by making sure the healers are pairwise similar enough, it doesn't matter too much whether you brought a white mage or an astrologian, or a scholar or a sage. And this also expands to the damage dealers. However, I believe the way we reached this point where it feels like everyone in a specific category can do everything, quote unquote, is partly to blame on, quote, what do you give the job that has everything, unquote. It is not exactly meant to be some sort of smoking gun like, see, old game better statement or something, but rather an interesting observation, that if we go all the way back to A Realm Reborn, it was a lot easier to see the limitations of each job. Paladin didn't have the capacity to heal itself. Well, I mean, it could pick Cure, but it ain't gonna do much. And it didn't have the capacity to do AoE damage. Meanwhile, it had superior mitigation compared to its warrior counterpart. While warrior could heal itself a bit, it was more of a cooldown kind of situation if anything. White mage had, essentially, one option to heal someone in a tight spot, but otherwise had to rely on GCD healing, which it did well. Meanwhile, Scholar's raid-wide healing started at Succor and ended at Whispering Dawn, which it might even have depending on which fairy was currently in use. This meant that Scholar was more like the toolbox healer. It had the response to any query, but mostly relied on its co-healer for the more heavy lifting part of healing. Between the mages, Summoner had access to a raise, but its rotation was heavily MP dependent, so this option came at a heavy cost. Meanwhile, Black Mage had infinite MP, but nothing to really spend it on aside from attacking. And between the melees, Dragoon was probably the more middle ground option, as it had ranged options, it had more defense and so on. Meanwhile, Monk didn't have ranged options and had to switch into Fists of Earth to have more reasonable damage reduction if it actually needed it. And Ninja was added later, so blah. And of course, Bard offered a whole slew of utility options, including pulsing MP recovery for the party. A very important detail here, however, is that back then you had 9 jobs for an 8-job boss fight. You need 2 tanks? There are exactly 2. You need 2 healers? Guess what? There are exactly 2. You need 4 DPS? You have 5 options unless you choose to have any duplicates, which would probably also be felt due to the distinct differences in each job. Imagine not having a bard. Because of this design, it could be argued there was a lot less need for concern about making sure all the jobs could equally perform a particular task. If Warrior wasn't well suited to main tank a boss, the Paladin would probably just do it. Things like that. But with 4 tanks, 4 healers, and, well, 13 DPS, it is perfectly possible that a job not being able to do a thing could exclude it entirely. In fact, with the amount of options we have now, a job might simply be excluded because it does a specific thing slightly worse than another job that competes for the same slot. For instance, Summon and Red Mage both are mages that can raise, but if you're picking a mage for them to raise, you're probably choosing a Red Mage because it does it better. But how did we get here? While it is definitely not the lone driving factor in this quote-unquote standardification of jobs, the concept of what do you give the job that has everything probably helped spur it on somewhat. Once a tank has all the mitigation it will ever need, what do you give it? Well, you could make it better at healing itself. What do you give a healer that has all the healing output it could ever need? Mitigation. What do you give the mage that already has all the damage buttons it needs? Utility. Or mitigation. And utility could be mobility. I guess you get the idea. To that end, I would like to give a couple of examples where I feel like I observed this kind of thing happen, but not quite in the way I just described. In Stormblood, Paladin's rotation somewhat boiled down to dot combo during fight or flight, 2 damage combos, and then 1 dot combo to finish the buff. Then spam Holy Spirit in magic buff window, and then dot combo, damage combo, and then sort of loop back around. Paladin also had a reasonably plentiful list of defensive options. They didn't want for anything. Shadowbringers comes, and Atonement and Confiteors added. Requiesced also makes your spells instant for the duration now. The inconvenience of being very immobile during magic is solved, and the inflexible nature of 2 full Royal Authority combos is alleviated with the freedom of Atonement. Again, Paladin wants for nothing. Endwalker comes, and now magic attacks heal, and due to how packed the rotation already is, while a new magic combo is added in the blades, this combo must apply the dot or things will get weird. So it does. The fact the blades combo itself applied the dot really underlined how cramped the Paladin rotation already was, as the only way to make space for it was to make sure it completely replaced the combo it was meant to replace. Of course, eventually, Paladin was reworked entirely, but arguably, the job was already full. Not that it necessarily became less full from the rework. Second example. Around Stormblood, it could be argued that Monk didn't need anything. Its 1-2-3s worked great, Greased Lightning made it very satisfying to maintain, and Perfect Balance could help recover. Similarly, Tornado Kick both offered a way to finish off fights and also a way to skillfully burst harder in certain situations. The job was, in some respects, the filler king and wanted for nothing. Perhaps aside from maybe a reliable ranged option. Shadowbringers comes around, and what do you give the job that wants nothing? 6-sided star, I guess. A decent option for when you have to step away for a second. Monk also generally had this weakness that if it was forced to stop for an extended period too frequently, it might be stuck slowly rebuilding Greased Lightning, which was gradually resolved by allowing Form Shift to maintain it. Although eventually this weakness and limitation was entirely removed by making the Greased Lightning effect entirely passive. Endwalker comes around, and the masterful Blitz changes the Monk from the full-on filler king to become more burst-centric in a way. But all things considered, the only thing we could argue that the Monk could desire is still a ranged attack. If they even wanted that at this point. Although, again, a slight weakness or limitation of the job is that extended periods of downtime affected its damage by needing to reapply Demolish and the Twin Snakes damage buff. Dawntrail comes around, reworking the job again, resolving these weaknesses, and, as it turns out, both of the new replies that Monk gains in Dawntrail have more range than any other weapon skill they have, with Fire's reply being long enough to possibly be considered an actual ranged attack. The only reason it rarely comes up is because it is a burst attack. You are not holding that for when you need it. The point I'm sort of trying to get across is that the limitations a job had in the past can be sort of a nebulous thing and not very obvious unless you look for it. And exactly what removes the limitation or weakness can sometimes be a multi-step process. The funny thing is that often the removal of a particular weakness or limitation is appreciated or praised, although sometimes it is pretty clear when a weakness is what makes the job for some players. For that, we would need to look no further than to Black Mage, where the reduced cast times and removal of timers indeed made the job generally more mobile and flexible, but removed the restrictive design of the job that many fell in love with originally. Which also leads me to my last point, which is a more general observation about limitations, and not so much job-specific stuff. More recently, I've made some videos pointing out some of the oversights or bugs or what have you in Final Fantasy XIV, like the jank associated with animation locks or buff caps, and the thing is, sometimes these kinds of problems, quote-unquote, can be considered mechanics, and by extension, be limitations themselves. However, whether that is the case or not, I feel, comes down to communication. For instance, GCDs and animation locks restrict how many things you can do at a time. This limits the player, and based on how deeply rooted this is in the game's design, we can probably argue that this is by design. The only thing that makes it jank is how it interacts with latency, which makes this system more limiting than it is meant to be if you have a less than stellar connection. Slide casting is another example of some jank in the game where, again, it has stuck around for so long that while it was almost certainly a bug initially, it is probably intended game design now. However, what makes it appear like a bug is that the game doesn't really explain this or ever communicates it. It looks like a mistake, even if it isn't at this point. And finally, which might sort of tie a bow on the job design angle too, buff-debuff caps. A player can have a combined 30 buffs and debuffs on them at any time, and once 30 has been reached, further additions of buffs are dodged, and I believe further debuff applications tend to shove random buffs off the list to make space. Enemies, notably bosses, supposedly can stomach up to 60 buffs and debuffs, but will only display 30, which, let's be honest, sounds janky just explaining it. Now, here's the thing. Let's say that jobs continue to accumulate more and more and more buffs they can apply and maintain. In such a game, a strict 30 buff cap could be a design choice, as while you might be able to completely nullify any attack against you if you were allowed to stack all the buffs you have available to you, the 30 buff limit makes you unable to. It could be intentional, right? However, as I was made aware of the last time I covered this topic, back when buff-debuff caps caused problems during the progression of the Omega Protocol Ultimate, the development team tried to just double the buff-debuff cap. For one day. Why only one day? You may have heard of this incident where players got impossible buffs during Thought and Unreal back in Endwalker. Dancers were able to spam technical finish, entire parties with astrologian card-drawn buffs, and so on. Long story short, this quick fix apparently caused the game to completely break in half. So while we might think these kinds of problems are easily fixed, the spaghetti code sometimes just says no, Lemao. But more importantly, while this should be obvious from the simple fact that hitting the buff-debuff cap doesn't tell you that you hit the cap, but rather just has buffs and debuffs fail to function properly, the fact that the development team tried to change it indicates that this, while it could be an intended limitation, is not. But it could be. This one goes out to you, Yoshi P and Creative Studio 3. Just like other jank in the game was embraced and, in a way, solved quote-unquote by being made a non-issue, smart design of buffs and debuffs and maybe an intended response when the cap is reached could implement the buff-debuff cap as a feature. an intentional limitation instead of a problem that needs to be solved. And this, in turn, could introduce new ways to limit the capability of a job, because limitations are cool. But what do you think? Do you have a nostalgic story of how the older, more limited designs of jobs made things more interesting to you? Maybe you prefer that all jobs can do everything, which is also fair, this is just my opinion of course. And granted, a limitation can also be that it is harder to do a thing for one job than it is for another. Either way, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in Heavensward, both Bard and Machinist could toggle a buff that made them do vastly more damage, but also applied cast times to most of their actions. Because of the sheer magnitude of damage gained, this was, in a way, not really an option to avoid. So, in a way, this addition limited a role that was previously more flexible and mobile. When Stormblood removed this feature, it was, at least to my knowledge, generally praised by the player base.